Colorado. Within our state boundaries is land once claimed by Spanish kings and Mexican governors. Although native people initially lived in the region, the first Europeans to visit came from Spain. Early Hispanic families moved north from New Mexico to settle in Colorado. During this program, we discover who the Hispanics are, where they came from, how they lived, and what they have contributed to the wonderful state of Colorado. Hispanic people have a long historical tradition in Colorado. They first came to farm and work the land.
In the 40s and 50s, people used to come together to help the neighbor put up their crops. They would all pitch in. It was kind of like a community type effort. They would go from farm to farm and put up the hay and stuff like that. And that's one way that they helped each other out.
The commons, which is called La Vega here, it was for grazing. You know, all the families could graze so many head of cattle, and it's still being run in the same way.
A decade before Colorado became a state, Spanish settlers had established ditches for irrigation that are still in use today. San Luis still uses its 1852 communal water ditch called acequia.
The acequia system still being run in the same way for irrigation. And we still have the mayordomos, and you still do the cleaning of the ditches in the spring. And so it's very beautiful, very cultural, but it's not just for preservation that we continue these. This is how people still live here.
We ate a lot of lamb because my grandpa had sheep, and a lot of times we had to help with cutting up the meat for carne seca or dried meat.
They were America's first cowboys, called caballeros, who introduced cattle and the rodeo to the Wild West.
Most of the livestock that was raised in Conejos County, I believe, would have been sheep and then also some cattle. The area that we used to graze was Los Brazos, and at the end of the grazing season up in the high country, we used to bring the flocks together, and then we would drive the herds all from the high country on down to private land. Some farmers used to produce crops like potatoes. In the 1960s and 50s, they used to produce a lot of lettuce.
The Latino holiday to honor deceased loved ones is El Día de los Muertos, Day of the Dead. Other holidays are still traditionally celebrated.
What I remember mostly about the holidays was the luminarias, the days building up to the Christmas holiday. Young men would gather. They would sing and dance, and they would build bonfires in every community.
San Francisco, they go all out. They have a bunch of little kids that are angels. And finally, on Christmas Eve, it's when they let you in. And there's a beautiful song that is sung all in Spanish.
So at Christmas we would have something called Mis Christmas, and people would come to the house and we would have like choke cherry wine for the adults.
Posada means a place where you go to rest. So it's a reenactment of everything that happened on the Nativity.
Santa Ana was our big holiday, just as big as Christmas. Santa Ana, you know, these little settlements always chose patron saint for protection.
Easter was important in that we used to have start with Ash Wednesday, and we used to go through fasting every Friday.
I remember the 4th of July. It was a day where families gathered and visited. It was like a giant homecoming. All the people who had grown up here would come back on the 4th of July.
Many of the foods we eat today were introduced by Hispanics. Denver's first Mexican restaurant may have been the Casa Maya, located today on 9th Street Park on the Auraria campus.
We, of course, had our traditional foods that we made. We would make empanaditas, and we grew up eating mostly elk and deer and wild game in my family.
We ate a lot of beans because my grandfather grew them. In the Summertime, they grew corn and made chicos.
Over there we use a lot of green chili, and we prepare that with meat and ground beef, and with also pork.
They would make sausage. We call it tripa. The blood was like fried and made into like a sausage sort, like chorizo.
Another thing that I used to enjoy a lot were bizcochitos. They were sugar cookies.
They were traditionally made for holidays, especially Christmas.
Many Hispanics in the southern part of the state began to migrate north to work in cities or the sugar beet industry.
I would say a large percentage of Hispanics were involved in agriculture, especially in the labor part of it, like picking potatoes in the fields and doing the flood irrigation on the fields and putting up of hay as well.
People would, in the summers, go work the fields and earn a little bit of money.
My grandfather was a farmer, and he grew a garden here. And so we tended to the garden, and we helped the neighbor that they shared the crops with for canning. And as a result of the farming, we had also wild quelites.
In 1960, there was 900 families living in Culebra. Most of them were adobe makers. So those people, I think, were probably here at Fort Garland, making adobes to build the fort.
There were no jobs, and there were no McDonald's, and there were no Burger Kings, and none of the fast food places were evident anywhere.
People that moved from the valley to work outside the valley, in Pueblo, for instance, they work for the CFNI. CFNI is a steel mill there in Pueblo, and they produced iron.
Other activities involved being in the cosmetology field. My wife and I opened a shop in Northwest Denver. I had quite a term in the business.
My mother, she used to work for the Head Start program. That was a second income for us in the household, and that's what a lot of families there in the San Luis Valley depend on.